Welcome to Life Expansion After 50 podcast. Today I'll be unpacking the idea of life expansion in the second half of the adult life. While life expectancy tables don't reset, they're set from from birth until whenever. Life expectancy tables had to do with life insurance. And so as you're going through life, you hear about, life expectancy is X. Well, if you do the research and you put in for specific updates, you can see that a person who's 50 years old today, let's say they were, give or take, they were born, say around 74 or 75, and now they're around 50. That 50-year-old person doesn't have the same life expectancy as they did at birth, right? Because there are people who didn't make it to 50, and those numbers go into the equation. If you further look at it and say, okay, in 2050, what's the life expectancy? It goes up again. And if you look at it and say, well, what about 2075? It goes up again. And then when you look at it based on advances in medicine and technology and all that, you're looking at basically mid-90s to about 104, 105 or so. I've been looking at that using a 50-year-old fixed. I've been using the 50-year-old fixed for probably 10 years, and it generally hasn't changed. It's between the low 90s, 93, 94, and 104 has been sort of a high water mark. But again, a person who's 100 years old, 50 years from now, is going to have an updated life expectancy, all things being equal. So that's the background of it. And the reason I bring it up is because I can still find people who just assume that their life expectancy is around mid-70s, and if they live past that, they're living, they're actually past their life expectancy, which is not true at all. The reason this is important is because at 50, you've been an adult for 30 years, and if your life expectancy is more like 90, you have another 40 years of your adult life. When you think about what you've done from 20 to 50, and now you're not starting over, you're starting from where you are. So you have the wisdom, you have the resources, you have the connections, you know what works, you know what doesn't work. You've got the discernment, the judgment that you're not going to make some of those mistakes. And you also know what you like. So it's not just about the life expectancy, is about taking care of your health, doing the things that you like, living into your passions. You have fewer options, some in part because of what you physically cannot do anymore, but also because you've decided that this is not for you and that's not for you. So you have fewer options, and by having fewer options, you can focus. You can do your own research. I encourage you to. There's a lot of guesswork in those numbers, but and I don't think it's worth debating to get the nuance. Suffice it to say that a person who's 50 years old today potentially can be walking around with a number that's in their mid-70s as in terms of life expectancy floating around in their head. With that in mind, they're thinking at 50, well, I've got another 20 or so years to live. What's the bother? Why am I going to worry about it? But suppose it was 40 more years. And now that person is sitting around for that 40 years when there's all sorts of things that can be done. What I like to look at is the freedom that you have now to choose, to make choices that you didn't have before. Whether you were raising a family or working on a career, whatever it was, some of those childhood dreams were put aside. It's just the way it is. What I'll tell you, those passions don't really change. Those childhood dreams and passions, while they may adjust, but they're still the same. Whatever you liked in those teen years, you probably still like. Now, there's going to be exceptions, of course. And I'm talking about a combination. I use the word passions, but I'm really, in this case, I'm talking more about purpose, what your purpose is, because purpose gives you that fuel to make it through lean times. The purpose is the thing you work for free because it's important to you. It's about the heart. Whereas the passions, that keeps us going. That inspires us to reach for higher heights. And having the two together, it just makes a lot of sense. And so I recommend starting with purpose, adding the passion into it as well. So now you're living those childhood dreams. You're doing those things that you love. You're creating experiences. You're not working. This is not about working. This is about designing a life that you're going to love living and then live that life. For people who are 50 and above, even younger than that, I'm sure there are disappointments that have come up, self-improvement related. People have tried these different things, self-improvement promises that just never came through. They've been disappointed. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't, sometimes it failed. Sometimes it seemed to fail at the worst possible time. Things have changed. First of all, neuroscientists have been super busy in the last 40 years, and they've uncovered many things that help us understand why self-improvement principles work and what goes wrong when they don't. But more importantly, you have the recipe now. The recipe can be laid out for you in terms of what you should be doing. I do recommend starting with purpose, though, because it's not going to be easy. Doesn't mean it's super hard. It's a good 3 to 6 month process to get yourself on track. But it's worth it, especially when you consider living the next 40 years just waiting around, right? So the point is, accept that it's available to you. And I think that's an important first step. You've got to accept that this is available to you, that you're not going to be walking around in the same condition that you are now, because you can change your brain. And that's the thing, when I said the neuroscientists have been at work. We now know that with neuroplasticity, the brain we're born with does not have to be the brain that we die with. Epigenetics tells us that the gene expression, the things that causes healing and why placebos work, that gene expression is not hereditary. It's from the internal environment. Our internal environment is the external environment of the cells. And the external environment of the cells is what they adapt to, and that adaptation is how they express. So as we change our internal environment, we also can influence how the genes express, and how the genes express is what leads to the epigenetics, which is why you have, as I said, placebos work, but also things like spontaneous remission and these different phenomena that have been going on. They're able to answer it now. The scientists and the neurobiologists have been able to answer it. Remember, when you design your life, you're also setting the rules. You set the parameters. Now, that statement requires breaking the bonds of your conditioning, because we're used to having the rules given to us, or at least in many cases, we've been living without a conditioned life for what seems like forever, but let's say it's your adult life, 30 years. In fact, it's probably less than that, because the prefrontal cortex is mainly formed between age 19 and 27. So by the time the prefrontal cortex is formed, that's sort of where we have our model of the world locked in. And then from there, shortly after that, we start living our lives 95% by habit. So it feels like forever, but it's been 20, probably less than 30 years that you've been living with this paradigm that you're in right now. And if you can change and update your conditioning, that's neuroplasticity. If you can update your conditioning to something that's more appropriate, because let's face it, if a 50-year-old today, when they were 0 to 7, that conditioning that you got then is not really going to serve you in 2025, let alone 2050 and 2075. Now, the importance of having a growth mindset cannot be understated. Now, when I talk about accepting that it's available to you, this is not a belief play. This is not about if you believe hard enough, it can happen. This is not a belief play. But you have to have a growth mindset, because without a growth mindset, you're not going to be able to see the opportunities, and you're not going to be able to access those opportunities. So when I talk about believing that it's available to you, it's not about the belief is going to make it happen. It's that the believing enables you to put one foot in front of the other and start taking the steps, and it allows you to get up and try. If you don't believe it's going to work, you're not even going to get up and try. That's the extent that I'm talking about with the belief. And one of the things I know that happens is, because we've been let down by ourselves so many times, we've been let down by others, it may be hard to believe that we can do the inputs day in and day out that are going to get us to our objective. We've all been hijacked, our emotions, right? The emotions have hijacked us and got us off track. And we know that that's a threat. We also know that we've been very, very close, and then it slipped through our hands. We know that, and those things hurt. But this is why you have the purpose. See, when you're doing it because of a job or because of some goal, it's not as deep in terms of meaning as when you're going on purpose. We're making this shift from I have to succeed to I'm going after my purpose. I'm on purpose pursuit, and I will keep working at it until I succeed. Now, when it doesn't work, that's feedback. It's just one more way that didn't work, but it's not failure. Just like a kid learning a skateboard trick, they go over and over and over, And it's not failure. They're just learning another way. It's got to be a little bit of different pressure. The timing has to be a little bit different. They're just finding ways that the timing and the pressure doesn't work, and they keep working at it till they do. Fast forward to after the prefrontal cortex is formed, we're in our 30s, and we look at those setbacks, those learning opportunities, that feedback. We look at it sometimes as failure, and that keeps us from going after it. So we've got to get that sense back that just like a baby's going to learn to walk, it doesn't care how many times he or she falls, the baby's going to learn to walk. And we have to think about it like that. When we're pursuing our purpose, we will get there. Let's think about this. We have people in their 80s. I know people who are in the 80s who fly planes, not only ride motorcycles, they ride motorcycles, renting them to do tours around the U.S. and other countries, 10 days in a row on a motorcycle. These are people in their 80s doing 200 and 300 miles a day. I've had customers doing that. I also know people in the 80s who still do motorcycle track days, and plenty of people in the 80s doing car track days. We also have politicians, examples of politicians flying around the country, hitting the campaign trail. Now, you may think they're old, but it's still, that's their deal. What I'm saying is if they can do it, whether you agree with the politician being 85 or not, the point is they're still living their life, flying all over the place, running campaigns, being on camera. What's to stop you from doing it? And I'm not suggesting it has to be work. Most of my examples tend to be around activity. That's just who I am. But it could be anything that any passion that's out there, any subculture out there in terms of an interest or a hobby, you're going to have people in the 70s and 80s still doing it, especially in the fitness world. And 90s too. It's just that we don't see the 90s as much. But by the time a 50-year-old today hits 80 because of movements like the one that I'm talking about right now, you're going to see more people living into the 90s with that same kind of vibrancy. Now, one of the things that we have to think about when we're looking at people who are 50 years old today is we didn't grow up with technology. And for the first 10 years of the 2000s, technology may have seemed like a challenge. But you know what? User experience was a big deal in the early 2000s, and it really took hold. And what that means is that virtually all of the major applications are designed with the same interface in mind, the user interface. The way user experience works is that they build it based on where people are going to look for things. That's why the login is always in the same place. That's why the reset your password always works the same. That's what works. That's what people expect. They're not going to change that. If you can use the major applications, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, Google, etc., you're going to be able to pretty much pick up an app. And there's an app for just about everything. If you look at pursuing your purpose 25 years ago compared to today, there's an app for everything. And not only that, there are offshore, you can hire people from offshore. Everything can be done virtual. You don't have to commute. There's just so much available to you from the technology. If you've shied away from it, I encourage you to get in. Just get in and start messing around. You're not going to break it, and if you do, it's an app. It's just call somebody and it's back online. I already talked about neuroplasticity, basically neuroplasticity. Now for most of our lives, we've understood how difficult it is to change habits. What we didn't know was that, yes, it's hard to break a habit, but when you replace a habit, you have what's called synaptogenesis working for you. So the neurotransmitter between the neurons actually self-eliminates for the neural pathway that's no longer firing or no longer active, so that the new neural pathway can build. That's why it's easier to replace a habit than it is to change one. That neuroplasticity makes it real. And with deep practice, just pick up the book, Angela Duckworth. The name of the book is Grit. The title is Grit. Or you can look at Dan Coyle. His book is The Talent Code. Both of those books talk about myelin, and they both talk about deep practice. And deep practice is one of the fundamentals of neuroplasticity. And I already mentioned epigenetics. That's sort of out of scope here, but just understand that there's more to it than meets the eye when it comes to your health. And I got to tell you, if you want to pick up, Bruce Lipton has been talking about this since the 60s. He's out on YouTube. He's got a couple of great books, Biology of Belief and Spontaneous Evolution. I really like Biology of Belief because he breaks it down. He even talks about his own journey from Newtonian physics to quantum physics as he looked at the neurobiology. Another guy, Dan Siegel, he's known for his neurobiology of relationships. You start understanding what goes into the habits and how easy they are to change. When I say easy, I'm talking about relative, certainly relative to what we were thinking before. But 3 to 6 months, you can have that command over your unconscious. Stepping back, and we say, okay, so what? Well, first of all, I think you want to start designing the life in such a way where you set the rules. You don't have to let somebody else give you the rules. Self-actualization, that's accessible to you today. I know Maslow's hierarchy of needs say you have to have the physiological needs, the safety needs, the love needs, the esteem needs before you can self-actualize, but there's nothing that says what the rules have to be. You set your own rules for what it means to be esteemed, what it means to be loved. You can give love and have oxytocin released. You can set your own rules around that and start self-actualizing today. Success. What is success? It's one of those things, I mean, you ask 100 people, you probably have 50 definitions. I've used for years the definition of success is the progressive realization of predetermined worthwhile personal goals. By that definition, it's about the progress. It's about the progress. So all those steps that you're taking, it's still success because you're making progress. And through that lens, you don't really fail until you stop trying. And if it's about your life design where you've decided to pivot, it's still not a failure. You decide what failure is. But again, it's your life, you design it, and you set it up. I would say think in terms of learning processes on purpose. Give yourself time to learn and enjoy the process of learning. Don't be so caught up on the calendar or the clock. Use on-ramps. Don't think you can just jump in and start doing it right off the bat. Use on-ramps to bring yourself up to speed. Learn, give yourself a little bit of grace. Use short-term fixes. You don't have to have the full solution. You can use a short-term fix. Do a lot of testing. Just enjoy and play with it. If it's your hobby, your passion, your love, your purpose, you can enjoy every moment. You don't have to wait until you arrive. And by the way, it's the journey anyway. It's not the destination. It's what we become along that journey. And doors open. When you are pursuing your purpose, doors open. It's like turning the flywheel. I love the book Good to Great. He talks about the flywheel and how in the beginning, it's a big, heavy flywheel he talks about. In the beginning, it's very hard to turn. It's a slow process. But each time you give it a turn, it gets easier and easier. And eventually, the momentum of the flywheel takes over. Now, he's talking about it in the context of business strategy. But it also applies in the context of your life, especially as you think about leaning into the second half. Just get that flywheel turning. The neuroplasticity becomes easier. And you start layering your conditioning, same way your conditioning layered on, or the first half of your adult life. Now, your conditioning can serve you. And it becomes easier and easier. Once you learn how to have the conscious mind in charge, it does get easier. In fact, next week, I'll introduce the 7 fitness areas, which is my roadmap for helping people put their conscious mind in charge so they could design their life and then live that life that they design. I encourage you to give this some serious thought. Remember, the time is going to pass anyway. It can pass with you waiting around as a bystander, or you can design your life, live that design, and be a participant in that life. I'll be back on next week with the 7 fitness areas.